The massive viewing window of the research station Harmony showed nothing but stars and the gentle curve of a distant planet. Inside the circular chamber, 12 different beings sat in a perfect circle, each representing their species in what had become known as the Heritage Night. The idea was simple enough: share the greatest stories of their ancestors, learn about each other's cultures, and build stronger bonds between the allied worlds. Ambassador Davis adjusted her simple gray uniform and watched as the Altani delegate prepared to speak. The crystalline being's body caught the soft lights of the chamber and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. When Veltar began speaking, his voice carried the harmonic quality that made all Altani speech sound like music. "Long before our sun learned to sing," Veltar said, "our ancestors danced between the stars themselves. They were beings of pure light who could bend space with their thoughts and speak to distant worlds through dreams. When the great darkness came to our galaxy, they gathered all their power and created new suns to push back the shadow. One of them, Lumiara the Bright, sacrificed her own light to create our home star. We still feel her warmth every day." The other delegates nodded respectfully. Several made notes on their recording devices. This was exactly the kind of story they expected: cosmic scope, incredible powers, sacrifice on a universal scale. Next came the Vorthak representative. Tekvar was built like a walking mountain, with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished stone. His people were known for their strategic minds and warrior culture. "My ancestors were the Storm Riders," Tekvar grumbled, his voice deep enough to vibrate through the floor. "They conquered not through force alone, but through wisdom that spanned millennia. General Kethmar once ended a 1,000-year war by moving an entire solar system 3 degrees to the left. The enemy forces found themselves orbiting empty space, while their supply lines collapsed across 40 worlds. Another ancestor, poet-warrior Velmuth, wrote battle plans so beautiful they became art, and art so moving it reshaped the minds of entire civilizations." More impressed nods, more notes taken. Davis noticed how each story seemed to try to outdo the last. The insectoid Clith delegate clicked and buzzed through her translation device. "The first mothers of our kind were larger than your biggest ships. They could create new types of life with their thoughts, growing cities from living coral and teaching the ocean itself to carry messages. One mother grew so wise she became the reef where my people still live today. She dreams, and her dreams become our laws. Her heartbeat sets the rhythm of our tides." And so it went around the circle. The gas giant dwellers spoke of ancestors, who rode lightning between the clouds and learned to think as fast as light itself. The plant-based Verdani told of root systems that connected entire continents, sharing thoughts and memories across thousands of miles. The energy beings called Spark had ancestors who helped create the very laws of physics, deciding how atoms would work and why gravity would pull instead of push. Each story was grander than the last. Beings who reshaped reality with their will. Ancestors who became forces of nature, or who transcended physical existence entirely to become one with cosmic forces. Powers that modern science could barely understand, let alone replicate. Davis listened to each tale with genuine interest. She took notes like the others, asked thoughtful questions about the cultural significance of each story. The other delegates seemed to appreciate her attention. They began to relax, sharing additional details about their legendary ancestors. The thermal singers, a species that communicated through temperature changes, spoke of ancestors who could freeze or boil entire oceans with a single note. The rocky granite folk shared stories of their ancestors, who grew into mountain ranges, becoming the solid foundation their civilization was built upon. As the night wore on, the stories grew more elaborate. Ancestors who had conversations with black holes, beings who could exist in multiple dimensions at once, heroes who saved not just their worlds but reality itself from various cosmic threats. Finally, only Davis remained. The chamber had grown quiet except for the gentle hum of the station systems. 11 pairs of alien eyes focused on her with expectation. They had heard humanity was a young species, but surely they had some grand tale to share. Perhaps their ancestors had battled supernovas, or learned to fold space, or communed with the living universe itself. Davis stood slowly. She was a small woman by human standards, middle-aged with graying hair and the kind of face that looked like it had seen a lot of life. Her uniform was the plainest in the room. No decorations, no signs of rank beyond a simple name tag that read, Ambassador L. Davis Earth. She looked around the circle at all the expectant faces. Some of the delegates had even activated their recording devices again, not wanting to miss humanity's contribution to the Heritage Night. "Thank you all for sharing such beautiful stories," Davis said quietly. Her voice was steady, but not particularly commanding. She spoke like someone used to being listened to, but not used to demanding attention. "I've learned so much about your cultures tonight. The scope of what your ancestors accomplished is truly amazing." She paused, glancing out at the stars through the great window. "My grandmother endured the cold," she said simply. The silence that followed was different from the respectful quiet that had greeted the other stories. This was confused silence. Several delegates glanced at each other. A few adjusted their translation devices, wondering if something had been lost in the conversion between languages. Veltar, the crystalline Altani, finally spoke up. His harmonic voice carried a note of polite confusion. "Forgive me, Ambassador Davis, but could you elaborate? What was this cold your ancestor endured? Was it perhaps a cosmic ice age or some form of stellar cooling that affected your entire system?" Davis shook her head slowly. "No, nothing like that, just winter. Very cold winter in a place called Chicago." The soft lighting in the Heritage Circle chamber seemed to dim as confusion settled over the gathered delegates. Davis remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back, looking perfectly comfortable despite the awkward silence that followed. Her simple statement. Tekevar, the four-armed Vorthak warrior, leaned forward in his massive chair. His stone-like face showed the kind of expression someone might wear when trying to solve a difficult puzzle. "Ambassador Davis," he said carefully, "perhaps there are translation difficulties. When you speak of your grandmother enduring the cold, are you referring to some great trial? A test of cosmic significance?" Davis smiled slightly. It was the kind of smile that held a lifetime of memories. Her name was Ruth. She was about 5 feet tall and weighed maybe 100 pounds. After a good meal, she lived through what we call the Great Depression and the Second World War, raised 7 children in a one-room apartment while her husband was overseas fighting. She began to walk slowly around the inner edge of the circle, her hands still, clasped behind her back, speaking in the same quiet, steady voice. "The winters in Chicago could drop to 20 below zero. That's 20 below the temperature where water freezes solid. Their apartment had thin walls and one small heating unit that worked maybe half the time. Ice would form on the inside of their windows, thick enough that she had to break it with her bare hands every morning just to see outside." The plant-based Verdani delegate rustled her leaves nervously. "But surely she had access to environmental controls. Climate modification technology." "She had 2 blankets," Davis said simply. "Cotton blankets that her mother had sewn by hand. When the heating failed, which it did regularly, she would burn furniture to keep the children warm. Chairs, table, legs, anything made of wood. She burned books when she had to." Several delegates exchanged glances. The energy beings called Spark flickered in what might have been confusion. Their translator device crackled as it tried to process the concept. Davis continued her slow walk. Ruth worked at a factory that made parts for military equipment. She would wake up at 4 in the morning, walk 15 miles through snow that was sometimes waist-deep, work a 12-hour shift on her feet, then walk home. She did this 6 days a week. On Sundays, she did laundry and mended clothes. The thermal singers began to generate small heat signatures, their equivalent of anxious muttering. One of them finally managed to speak through their temperature translation device. But surely she had transportation, vehicle systems, even primitive mechanical assistance. She walked because they couldn't afford anything else, Davis explained patiently. The bus cost money they didn't have. There were days when she walked that 15 miles on shoes that had holes in the bottom. She would stuff newspapers inside to keep her feet dry, but the snow would soak through anyway. The crystalline Altani delegate Veltar was making soft harmonic sounds that indicated deep confusion. Ambassador, forgive my directness, but what powers did your ancestor possess that allowed her to survive such conditions? What abilities did she command? Davis stopped walking and turned to face him directly. None. No powers at all. She was completely ordinary by human standards. No special abilities, no enhanced strength, no resistance to cold or hunger. She was just a small woman who refused to let her children die. The chamber fell into another uncomfortable silence. Several delegates were clearly struggling with this concept. The gas giant dwellers who existed as living storm systems couldn't seem to process how something so fragile could survive anything. There were days when there wasn't enough food, Davis continued, sitting back down in her chair. Ruth would tell the children she wasn't hungry and give them her portions. She once went 6 days without eating so her kids could have something. She learned which weeds in the city parks were safe to eat and which would kill you. In the middle of winter, she would dig through frozen ground looking for anything edible. The rocky granite folk delegate shifted his massive bulk. When he spoke, his voice sounded like grinding stone. This makes no logical sense. Why did the community not provide resources? Why did the stronger members not take responsibility for resource distribution? Because everyone was struggling, Davis replied. The whole city, the whole country was dealing with economic collapse. Millions of people were unemployed. There wasn't enough food or fuel or warm clothes to go around. People were dying of hunger and cold everywhere. She looked around the circle, seeing the confusion on every alien face. But Ruth never stopped trying. When food became available again after the war ended, she organized community gardens. She taught other mothers how to preserve vegetables, how to stretch a small amount of meat to feed a large family, how to identify edible plants that grew wild in the city. The insectoid Clith delegate clicked rapidly, her translation device struggling to keep up. But what was the purpose of these individual efforts? How could one small being affect larger systemic problems? Davis was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the stars through the great window. She didn't think about systemic problems. She thought about making sure her children survived another day, and then another day after that. When winter ended, she thought about preparing for the next winter. When her children grew up, she helped them prepare for their own winters. Tekvar leaned back in his chair, his forearms crossed. There was something in his expression that might have been dismissal. With respect, Ambassador, I struggle to understand how this relates to ancestral heritage. My ancestors commanded fleets that spanned galaxies. They developed strategies that ended thousand-year conflicts. What lesson could possibly be drawn from one weak creature struggling against basic environmental challenges? For the first time that evening, Davis's expression changed. The slight smile disappeared and her eyes became very direct and very serious. The lesson, Tekvar, is that Ruth wasn't unusual. She represents millions of human ancestors who faced impossible situations and simply refused to give up. We don't worship distant gods who reshaped reality with their thoughts. We remember ordinary people who did extraordinary things because someone had to. Dawn was breaking over the planet below Harmony Station, painting the observation deck in soft orange light as the delegates gathered for what had become an unofficial continuation of Heritage Night. Word had spread through the station about the previous evening's unusual conclusion, and several other species representatives had joined the original circle. Davis sat quietly with a cup of coffee, watching the planet's terminator line creep across continents far below. The other delegates were engaged in animated discussions among themselves, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, harmonics, temperature changes, and electromagnetic pulses. The Vorthak Tekvar approached her table with measured steps. His forearms were crossed and his stone-like features showed the expression of someone who had spent the night thinking about uncomfortable questions. Ambassador Davis, he said formally, I have consulted with my war council overnight. They are perplexed by your presentation yesterday. Davis looked up from her coffee. Perplexed how? Tekvar pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. My military advisors cannot understand how your species survived long enough to develop space travel. Based on your description of ancestral capabilities, humans should have been eliminated by natural selection millennia ago. Other delegates began drifting toward their conversation. The crystalline Altani Veltar settled nearby, his light-refracting body catching the morning sun from the observation window. The plant-based Verdani delegate rustled closer, her root system making soft scratching sounds on the deck plates. "That's an interesting way to put it," Davis replied. "What exactly did your advisors find problematic?" Tekvar gestured with two of his arms. "You describe ancestors who possessed no enhanced capabilities, no superior technology, no cosmic awareness, yet they face challenges that should have been impossible for such limited beings. The mathematical probability of survival under the conditions you described approaches zero." The insectoid Clith delegate had been listening from across the room. She clicked over to join the growing group, her translation device buzzing. "Our hive mathematicians calculated similar impossibilities. Individual organisms with no specialized adaptations, facing resource scarcity without collective support systems, should not achieve reproductive success." Davis sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "What if I told you that Ruth had 8 grandchildren, 12 great-grandchildren, and so far 6 great-great-grandchildren?" The silence that followed was profound. Several delegates exchanged glances that suggested they were questioning either Davis's honesty or their own mathematical models. Veltar's harmonic voice carried notes of confusion. "This indicates not merely survival, but thriving population expansion. How is this possible?" "Because Ruth wasn't trying to achieve optimal resource allocation or maximum survival probability," Davis explained patiently. "She was trying to make sure her kids had enough to eat today, and tomorrow and the day after that. Every single day she woke up and asked herself what needed to be done to keep her family alive. And then she did those things." The rocky granite folk delegate had been silent until now. When he spoke, his voice rumbled like distant earthquakes. "Our geological surveys indicate that your homeworld Earth experiences regular catastrophic events. Ice ages, volcanic periods, asteroid impacts, climate shifts that would eliminate most developing civilizations. Yet your species not only survived but expanded globally before achieving space travel." "We're stubborn," Davis said simply. Tekvar leaned forward. "Explain." "Stubborn." Davis set down her coffee cup and looked around at the gathered delegates. "About 15,000 years ago, most of Earth was covered in ice. Glaciers a mile thick. The few areas that weren't frozen were either desert or swamp. Food was scarce, shelter was hard to find, and every winter killed off a significant portion of the human population. The energy beings called Spark flickered into the conversation area, their translator crackling. Optimal strategy would be to seek more hospitable planetary environments or enter stasis until conditions improved. Humans decided to stay and figure out how to live in the ice," Davis continued. "They learned to make better tools, build better shelters, preserve food more effectively, work together more efficiently. Instead of adapting to the environment, they made the environment work for them." The thermal singers generated a warm pulse that their translator interpreted as skepticism. "Primitive technology levels would make such environmental modification impossible." "They didn't modify the environment," Davis corrected. "They modified themselves. Not genetically, mentally. They changed how they thought about problems. Instead of seeing ice as an obstacle, they saw it as a resource. They learned to build ice houses, to preserve food in ice, to use frozen rivers as highways." The aquatic Neri delegate spoke from their water-filled communication sphere. "This suggests adaptation through learned behaviors rather than evolutionary changes. Most species require significant time periods for such adaptation." "Humans adapt within single generations," Davis replied. "Sometimes within single years. When the volcanic winter of 1816 wiped out crops across half the planet, farmers didn't wait for climate recovery. They planted different crops, developed new preservation methods, found alternative food sources. They adapted to the new conditions in one growing season." Tekvar's expression had shifted from dismissive to genuinely puzzled. "But such rapid adaptation requires abandoning established methods, accepting high failure rates during learning periods, taking enormous risks with survival resources." "That's correct. This is irrational behavior," Davis smiled. From your perspective, probably. From a human perspective, it's practical. Ruth didn't have the option of waiting for optimal conditions. The depression wasn't going to end just because she needed it to. So she learned to make soap from ashes, to stretch a pound of flour into bread for 10 people, to identify which garbage contained anything useful. The plant-based Verdani rustled thoughtfully. But such individual adaptation cannot account for species-level survival. Surely your civilization provides support systems, resource distribution networks, collective decision-making processes. Sometimes, Davis agreed. But mostly, human civilization is millions of people like Ruth, all figuring out how to solve their individual impossible problems, and occasionally sharing solutions when they work. The Clith delegate clicked rapidly. This suggests highly inefficient resource utilization. Why do your individuals not specialize in optimal survival strategies and share that information systematically? Davis laughed softly. Because there are no optimal strategies. Ruth's solutions worked for Chicago in the 1930s. They might not work for farmers in Australia in 1816, or colonists on an asteroid in 2387. So every human learns to figure things out for themselves. She looked around at the confused faces surrounding her. You keep asking about efficiency and optimization and probability calculations, but humans don't optimize for survival. We optimize for adaptability. We assume that whatever we're prepared for isn't what we'll actually face, so we get good at improvising solutions with insufficient resources under impossible conditions. Tekvar was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its dismissive tone. Your species deliberately trains for failure scenarios. We train for Tuesday, Davis corrected, because Tuesday is usually when the impossible problems show up. The silence that followed Davis's words felt different from the confused quiet that had marked earlier moments in the Heritage Circle. This was the kind of silence that comes when people start to understand something they're not sure they want to understand. Kethara, the tall crystalline moderator who had organized the Heritage Night, finally spoke. Her voice carried the formal tones of someone trying to restore diplomatic order to a conversation that had grown unexpectedly heated. Ambassador Davis, she said carefully, perhaps there are other human ancestral legends you could share. Surely this survival story, while interesting, is not representative of your species' greatest achievements. Davis sat back down, folding her hands in her lap. She looked tired suddenly, like someone who had been trying to explain something obvious for a very long time. That's exactly the point, Kethara. Ruth isn't unique among human ancestors. She represents what we consider normal. What you're calling a survival story, we call Tuesday. The gas giant dwellers who existed as living storm systems began to generate atmospheric disturbances that their translator interpreted as distressed muttering. One of them finally managed to form words through the communication system. We do not understand. You describe extreme hardship as normal experience. This suggests either widespread system failure or species-level adaptation difficulties. Both, Davis replied simply. Humans have never lived in a perfect world. Our planet tries to kill us regularly. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, droughts, diseases that wipe out entire populations. We evolved in a place where survival required constant effort and adaptability. She gestured toward the viewing window where stars shone peacefully in the darkness. Your species developed on worlds that provided what you needed. You grew into cosmic consciousness because you had the luxury of thinking about cosmic problems. We spent most of our history just trying to make it through winter. Tekvar was still standing, his forearms now hanging at his sides rather than crossed defiantly. Something in his expression had changed during Davis's explanation, though he still looked skeptical. But surely your modern civilization has moved. Beyond such primitive concerns, you have achieved space travel, joined the galactic community, developed advanced technologies. We have, Davis agreed. But we didn't leave those experiences behind. We built our civilization on the foundation of people like Ruth. Every human colony ship carries descendants of people who walked 15 miles through snow to work in factories, who gave up their food so their children could eat, who broke ice with their bare hands because it needed to be done. The Verdani delegate rustled thoughtfully. You speak as though these survival traits persist in your modern population. Surely, technological advancement has eliminated such hardships? Davis shook her head. Technology changes the problems, not the approach. Last year, a human mining colony on Kepler 438b lost their main power grid during a solar storm. 2,000 people, no heat, no light, temperatures dropping to levels that would kill them in hours. She paused, looking around the circle. They didn't wait for rescue ships. They didn't debate optimal resource allocation strategies. They broke into work teams, rationed their emergency supplies, and jury-rigged heating systems from mining equipment. When the rescue ships arrived 3 weeks later, they found a functioning community that had not only survived, but had improved their mining efficiency by 30%. The energy beings flickered rapidly. 3 weeks without proper infrastructure support? The casualty rates must have been significant. Nobody died, Davis said simply. Some people got sick. Everyone was tired and cold and scared, but nobody died. Because they approached it like Ruth approached Chicago winters. Figure out what needs to be done. Do it with whatever you have available. Keep doing it until the situation improves. Veltar, the Altani delegate, made soft harmonic sounds of what might have been dawning comprehension. You are suggesting that human civilization is built upon the accumulated experience of individuals who treated survival extremes as normal challenges. Not just treated them as normal, Davis corrected. Treated them as solvable. Ruth didn't accept that her children would starve or freeze. Tom didn't accept that the beach couldn't be taken. The colonists on Kepler 438b didn't accept that loss of power meant loss of life. The rocky granite folk delegate shifted his massive bulk, creating small vibrations in the deck. This explains certain puzzling aspects of human colonial expansion. Your species establishes settlements in locations that other civilizations consider uninhabitable. We consider them challenging, Davis replied. There's a difference. The insectoid Clith clicked rapidly, her translation device working overtime. But this approach seems inefficient. Why not simply avoid problematic situations? Why not wait for optimal conditions before expanding? Davis smiled, the first genuinely amused expression she'd shown all evening. Because there are no optimal conditions. Ruth couldn't wait for the depression to end before feeding her children. Tom couldn't wait for better odds before taking the beach. If humans waited for optimal conditions, we'd still be sitting in caves, watching ice storms and hoping someone else would invent fire. Texvar finally sat back down, his movements slow and thoughtful. Your warrior ancestor, this Tom. You said he was afraid? Terrified. The night before the landing, he wrote a letter home. He told his mother he was so scared he could barely hold his hand steady enough to write. Yet he proceeded with the mission anyway, because being scared didn't change the fact that the job needed doing. Tekvar was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its dismissive tone. My ancestors were never afraid. They commanded such power, possessed such wisdom, that fear was unknown to them. That must have been nice, Davis said without sarcasm. But fear is useful. It keeps you careful. Ruth was afraid every winter that she wouldn't be able to keep her family alive. That fear made her plan ahead, save every scrap, learn new skills. The colonists on Kepler 438b were afraid of dying in the cold. That fear made them work together and find solutions they never would have considered under normal circumstances. The chamber had grown very quiet. Several delegates were making notes, but their movements were thoughtful rather than routine. The Nere representative spoke through their water-filled communication sphere. We begin to understand why human diplomatic solutions often seem unconventional. You approach galactic problems as individuals rather than as civilizations. We approach them as people, Davis corrected gently. When faced with a crisis, we don't look for cosmic solutions or wait for transcendent wisdom. We look around the room for whoever seems most like Ruth, hand them whatever tools are available, and expect them to figure out how to fix things. 3 days had passed since the Heritage Night, but the conversation started in that circular chamber continued throughout Harmony Station. Davis found herself invited to meals, asked to join research discussions, and drawn into informal gatherings. where delegates peppered her with questions that had nothing to do with official diplomatic business. She was sitting in the observation lounge, watching a small fleet of maintenance robots repair a section of the station's outer hull, when Veltar approached. The crystalline Altani moved with careful grace, his light refracting body creating small rainbows on the walls as he walked. "Ambassador Davis, may I join you?" She gestured to the chair beside her. "Of course. Beautiful view, isn't it?" Veltar settled into the chair with a soft chiming sound. "I have been thinking about your grandmother Ruth," he said without preamble. "Yesterday I spoke with my homeworld council about her story. They found it difficult to understand." "That doesn't surprise me," Davis replied. "It's a very human story." "Yes, but that is what troubles them. And me." Veltar's harmonic voice carried notes of confusion. "My people have revered our light-dancing ancestors for thousands of years. We built our entire civilization around the idea of transcending physical limitations, of becoming one with cosmic forces. But now I wonder, what problems did those ancestors actually solve?" Davis turned to look at him directly. "What do you mean?" "Our legends speak of ancestors who could manipulate light across star systems, who danced between dimensions, who created new suns," Veltar continued. "But when I examined our actual history, I realized something disturbing. These cosmic beings never faced scarcity. They never had to choose between competing needs. They never had to make impossible decisions with insufficient resources." Davis nodded slowly. "They never had to break ice with their bare hands." "Exactly." The Altani's crystalline form flickered with what might have been embarrassment. "When our colony on Rigel 7 lost their atmospheric processors last year, we waited for replacement parts from the homeworld. 43 people died during the 3-month delay because we could not conceive of alternatives. We are descendants of beings who could create new stars, yet we cannot solve basic life support problems." Through the observation window, Davis watched one of the maintenance robots struggling with a particularly difficult repair. Its tools weren't quite right for the job, but it kept trying different approaches, adapting its technique until it found something that worked. "The other delegates have been having similar conversations," she said quietly. "Tekvar told me yesterday that his people haven't fought a real war in over 1,000 years, not because they're peaceful, but because their strategic planning has become so theoretical that they can't adapt when situations don't match their models." Veltar made soft harmonic sounds. "The Clith have discovered that their hive mind efficiency breaks down completely when they can't maintain constant communication. The energy beings admitted that they've never faced a problem they couldn't solve by simply applying more power." Davis was quiet for a moment, thinking. There's nothing wrong with having cosmic ancestors or advanced civilizations. But when you base your entire culture on the idea that your predecessors were perfect beings who never struggled, you lose something important. What do we lose? The knowledge that struggle is normal, that fear is useful, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to. She gestured toward the maintenance robot, which had finally succeeded in its repair and was moving on to the next section. That robot doesn't have perfect tools or optimal conditions. It has a job to do, so it figures out how to do it. Over the following days, the informal conversations grew into something more structured. The delegates began organizing what they called practical heritage sessions, sharing not the grandest legends of their species but the overlooked stories of ordinary individuals who had faced impossible situations. The Granite Folk delegate told about a mining engineer named Kef, who had saved an entire underground city by hand-digging drainage tunnels during a flood. He wasn't a legendary figure, just someone who understood that the water had to go somewhere and was willing to dig until he found where. The thermal singers shared the story of a teacher named Whisper of Warmth who had kept a group of children alive during a volcanic winter by teaching them to regulate their body temperature through breathing techniques. She wasn't mentioned in their great thermal symphonies, but every child who lived through that winter remembered her lessons. Even Tekvar contributed. He spoke about a logistics coordinator named Beth Tar, who had once supplied a stranded battle group by completely rebuilding the Army's supply chain in real time. She wasn't a warrior poet or a cosmic strategist. She was someone who understood that soldiers needed food and ammunition, and found ways to get those things to where they were needed. The most surprising revelation came from the energy beings, called Spark. They had always claimed their ancestors were pure thought, beings of perfect logic who had helped design the fundamental forces of the universe. But when pressed for practical examples, they admitted that their greatest ancestor was probably an individual called Steady Current, who had spent her entire existence maintaining power flow to critical systems during a galaxy-wide energy crisis. She never created cosmic forces. Their translation device crackled. She just made sure the lights stayed on for 800 years while smarter beings figured out permanent solutions. Davis found these stories more interesting than any of the cosmic legends shared during Heritage Night. These were people she could understand, individuals who saw problems and solved them with whatever they had available. The final session of VR. The extended cultural exchange took place in the same circular chamber where Heritage Night had begun. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of formal presentations about mythical ancestors, the delegates talked like colleagues sharing practical knowledge. The question, said Cathera, the crystalline moderator, is what we do with these insights. How do we apply this understanding to current galactic challenges? Tekvar leaned forward in his chair. The Hegemony Consortium border dispute has been deadlocked for 6 months. Both sides keep waiting for perfect negotiating conditions that will never exist. Perhaps it's time to find someone willing to work with imperfect solutions. The Nere delegate rippled thoughtfully in their water sphere. The colony ship Endeavor has been stranded in the outer spiral for 3 years while we debate optimal rescue strategies. Maybe we should ask what a human maintenance crew would do with available resources. Davis pulled out her communication device as it chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen and smiled, the first genuinely happy expression the other delegates had seen from her during the entire exchange. Speaking of practical solutions, she said, holding up the device, I just got a message from home. The image showed 5 generations of humans gathered around a dinner table. An elderly woman sat at the head of the table, her hair white but her eyes bright and alert. Children and adults of various ages filled the chairs around her, all smiling, at the camera. The handwritten note attached to the image read, Ruth's 98th birthday party was perfect. The stew came out good this time, made enough for everyone. Weather's been cold lately, but we're managing fine. Hope your space meeting is going well. Love, Mom. Davis showed the image to the other delegates, who studied it with interest. Your grandmother Ruth is still alive? Veltar asked, his harmonic voice carrying notes of surprise. My great-grandmother, Davis corrected. She's the little girl in the back row. The woman at the head of the table is her daughter, Ruth's youngest child. She's the one who taught me Ruth's stories. The chamber fell quiet as the delegates absorbed this information. Tekvar was the first to speak. Your ancestral wisdom isn't ancient history, it's continuing guidance. That's right, Davis replied, tucking the communication device back into her pocket. Human ancestors aren't distant legends we worship. They're the foundation we build on every day, everywhere we go. Ruth's great-great-granddaughter is probably dealing with some kind of impossible situation right now, and she'll handle it the same way Ruth handled Chicago winters. Figure out what needs to be done, do it with whatever's available, keep going until things improve. She looked around the circle at faces that now showed understanding rather than confusion. And that's why humans seem so confident about surviving whatever the galaxy throws at us. Not because we think we're special, but because we've been practicing for impossible situations our entire history.